On February 10th, 1978, Stained Class, the fourth studio album by the legendary British heavy metal band Judas Priest, was released. So here are some facts that absolutely every metal maniac has to know about the album. Let's start with the obvious. It is the first time the world has seen the Judas Priest logo we all know today. Before that, Judas Priest was using either a simple text, like on the Rock'n'Rolla original cover, or a Gothic script logo, which they used on the consecutive two albums. Yet this time, the artist Roslav Żabo actually felt like the original Gothic script logo wouldn't really match with the sci-fi futuristic album cover, which by the way reflected the band's lyrics and the entire feel of the album. So he decided to come up with something electric, something like a lightning bolt, if you will, to capture the band's essence, the energy, the whole idea of this album. And this is how the classic Judas Priest logo was born. It is the first and the only studio album to feature the drummer Les Binks. He joined the band shortly before recording of Stained Class began and left shortly after the classic Unleashed in the East was released. In fact, did you ever notice that he's not seen on the cover, neither in front nor in the back, covered by Rob? In fact, according to Les, and actually Les only, he was not paid for Unleashed in the East, and that's why he thought that he's better than Judas Priest and he would better leave and continue his career elsewhere. Yet despite being in the band for only 2.5 years, Les Binks actually left an enormous footprint on the band's discography. For Stained Class is actually the only Judas Priest album to this very day to feature each 5 of the Judas Priest members as songwriters. Yes, Les Binks actually received a songwriting co-credit for the legendary Beyond the Realms of Death, for which we're very, very thankful. After that, most of the band's songs were written by Glenn, Rob, KK, who was later replaced with Richie, of course, and Ian Hill occasionally. Yet it never was the case that all 5 band members contributed to the songwriting process on any of the future Judas Priest albums up until 2021 at least. Despite touring almost the entire world after Sad Wings of Destiny and Sin After Sin and going to the United States for the very first time, Judas Priest albums never cracked Billboard until Stained Class. To be fair with you, they barely made it and cracked the Billboard 200 on 190th point, yet they still did it. And that was a big deal for a British band back then. Yes, of course, years later when Stained Class started to be considered as a classic heavy metal album, it became certified as gold and so on and so forth, but at that time that was actually a huge deal for Judas Priest. Better by You, Better Than Me, a song which changed the course of the Judas Priest and the entire heavy metal history, was not supposed to be on that album. You see, it was actually a last-minute addition. In fact, the CBS Records at that point thought that the album overall feel and its sound was too dark and too sinister. Little did they know. So they decided to add another cover, and it was Better By You, Better Than Me.
It's better by you, better than me.
At that point, the album producer Dennis McKay was not available anymore, and therefore Better By You, Better Than Me was actually recorded separately from the entire Stained Class session and produced by James Guthrie. In fact, the band loved him so much that they invited him to produce their next studio album. But we are gonna talk about that in the future episodes. More than a decade later, the band actually was accused of encouraging 2 teens to commit a suicide through that song. I'm actually not gonna go into the details of that lawsuit in this episode. I'm sure you know a lot about it, probably more than me. But if you would like to know my personal take on it and the history of it a little bit more, leave it in the comments. I'll try to make a special episode. Yet one thing is pretty crazy. 3 months later, after the end of the lawsuit, the band embarked on their Painkiller World Tour, and they kicked it off with Better By You, Better Than Me, played in Burbank, California on the 13th of September. and thus playing it for the very first time live since 1979 and increasing its popularity by tenfold. Yet, instead of Better By You, Better Than Me, there should have been another cover on that album. You see, back then, every label and every recording company thought that in order for an album to succeed, the band should just simply make a cover for something that is long forgotten. And just to be fair, Judas Priest actually does that extremely well. And therefore, they actually recorded during the Stained Class recording session a cover on Race with the Devil, a 1968 hit by the UK band The Gun.
You better run, you better run, you better run from the devil's gun.
Yet, that song never made it on the album for some reason and only was released in 2001 as a bonus track to Sin After Sin reissue. Why? No idea, don't ask, but if you do know, please let us know in the comments. Not everybody knows, but most of KK Downing's solo on this album, the solos we absolutely love and enjoy to this very day, were spontaneous. You see, most of the critics back then, and actually most of the Judas Priest historians, agreed to this very day that Glenn Tipton was always a more precise guitarist, yet at the same time KK was always the expressionist. He was always this passionate guy, both on stage and while recording the album. So he would simply roam around the studio late at night in his earphones, listening to what they've already recorded and playing around, just ad-libbing. And this is how most of KK's solos actually were written. And therefore, the sound and the tune we hear today, 40 plus years later, and love so much, was developed. After releasing this album, the band embarked on a world tour, going throughout the United States once again, throughout Europe of course, and for the very first time visiting Japan. As Rob remembers, decades later, they actually experienced something of a Beatlemania-like, a Judas Priest mania, if you will, back there. And this is where they actually recorded their legendary Unleashed in the East, which we are going to talk about at some point in the future. The album's sound was something of an outer world for most rockers and metalheads of that time. Why? Because most of the heavy metal albums, including the first 3 albums by Judas Priest, were kind of psychedelic, with a very dark tone and very melancholic at the same time. Yet on this album, Judas Priest decided to combine the energy punk rock had with the heavy metal vibes, and therefore establishing an absolutely new heavy metal sound, which gave a way for development for so many new wave of British heavy metal bands, including the legendary Iron Maiden. And while the album actually did not receive an amazing response back in 1978, I personally believe that it is one of the greatest, one of the most legendary, and one of the most powerful heavy metal albums of all times. And what do you think? Leave your favorite tracks in the comments and let's start a meaningful conversation. I would like to know any facts that I missed. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel on YouTube, because we are going to do that about every Judas Priest album throughout the year. Keep rocking.